Okay, hello. Happy, I don't know if it's ever happy, Armistice Day, Veterans Day, uh, at least in the US. So we are en vacances, I suppose. Um, we're gonna continue with what I was doing yesterday, and that is discussing Andrew Higginbottom's stuff on Lecture 9. It sort of is a way of capping what he was talking about before. Not that we're going to listen to it necessarily, and you'll have to suffer with me for a little bit. What I managed to do in my usual waste of time is to actually make a fairly complete copy of, it's not a copy so much as it is just transcription of the two Paul's translation of chapter 1 of volume 1 of Capital. And so I may discuss that for the remainder of the week. In this particular today, we're going to look a little bit at structure of capital. Just reminding ourselves that, there are 3 volumes, that they are integrated in a certain way, or at least related. That's a whole system of argument in and of itself, and worth considering. It is fairly complicated in that sense, but on the other hand, it's not as difficult as one thinks. What was nice about the Lecture 9 was that Higginbottom does more comparative stuff, introduces Rosa Luxemburg, among others, Bukharin. I think those are kind of important if we're going to talk about particularly the theories of imperialism. And lest you think that's unimportant, we are currently, imperialism's kind of doing a good deal today in this very moment. We have all sorts of examples of how it operates, and we'll see more of them for the next 4 years. It'll be pretty blatant. Things which we saw, over 4 years ago will come back. We'll see sanction lifting, oligarchs having more fun, etc. All that's going to happen. But the nice thing about what Higginbottom does is to show us that, there's a pretty consistent literature on this. This diagram is actually a really good diagram. It's one of his slides, and it's towards the end, but it shows everything as it kind of fits together. Bukharin in 1915, Hilferding in 1910, Engels, Bissell, Marini, Jaffe, Kautsky, Luxemburg. All of those things show the particular place in which these authors have discussed capital and its relationship to not only capital but the theories of surplus value. So I particularly like this lecture by Higginbottom, because he's talking about the key elements that one worries about in kind of the current context. Is there, for example, underconsumption, overproduction? How are crises created? How does capitalist crisis occur? And in the 21st century, it's sometimes hard to see it while you're in it, but you could say that it's like maybe not having one big stroke, but lots of little mini strokes in terms of how sort of the brain of capitalism operates. So in this particular lecture, it's fairly systematic. That is discussing Lenin, Luxemburg, Bukharin, and then there's a neo-Luxemburgian kind of a type, and raising the important question. I think the one that continues, it becomes even more apparent when during the rise of repression. That is, reform and revolution, and of course acceleration. So anyway, he discusses some of the differences and hits the point on, as I mentioned yesterday, was referencing the difference between aggregate and total social capital. And this is that idea about what's the difference between the individual, and that is in a micro sense, and the macro, and how is it that the masses are not necessarily just simply an aggregated bunch of individuals, but it is thinking about what happens at these sort of abstracted levels. So he begins talking about issues that relate to the key point. Ultimately it's the conversion of surplus value to profit. A one way of thinking about the system or series of abstractions that occur, and it is about circulation, as volume 2 might refer to it. The issue, of course, with chapter 21 is that it's incomplete. And I was going to put up the Ed George version of this, the notes on chapter 21. I'll do that probably tomorrow. And that is, what happens when the entire system expands at scale. We were discussing that earlier, that things that occur that we might think occur at a micro level, once we start expanding the relative scale of things, the abstractions become clearer, I guess. And that seems a little counterintuitive on the one hand, but there is a kind of way in which some things, even as they become more complicated, actually can simplify. Now, I know that the algebra doesn't make necessarily that argument, and I think he goes a little bit off track here when talking about the sort of the basic extended equations, and this is standard stuff, actually. This is not obtuse from a math point of view, and not obtuse from the volume 2 perspective, and that is that Department 1 and Department 2 do exist together, and they serve a way in which, once you start thinking of it as related, that they serve as an organic whole. So as Higginbottom points out from Radolsky's text, the rates of accumulation in both departments most move in inverse proportion to the organic compositions. So this is still all about the ratios as the thing gets bigger. So what's the problem? How does capitalism, expand and reproduce itself as capital accumulation through circulation? That is, through buying and selling, markets, and money. Does capitalism have to go into crisis? And if so, why? And a lot of ink has been spilled on this. But when we remember, as I pointed out before, to see this in context, 19th century did have a lot of very serious, very at least from the European point of view, large-scale revolutions or upheavals. Actually, upheavals do occur elsewhere in the world. There's other things in other parts, East Asia. There's a couple of very major, terrible things that occur, and South Asia. So these things are going on. Crises are occurring, but trying to reconcile them with some way in which you can explain to people, well, this is kind of a regular feature. It's not a bug. It is a regular feature of the way things operate. That's what is important. And it's even more difficult, as I think we've seen when we look at the current situation of, it's kind of frustrating. It's like all there was progress actually from 2020 to 2024, but in the U.S., it's going to have to take a step backward. There will be forward movement at certain regional levels, but at a national level, um, as with the loss of the 4 years during the first Trump administration, the second Trump administration is going to attempt to roll back many features of the American federal administrative state, which, some people could argue that's a good thing. It's a stage at which the you one is attacking the nature of the state. On the other hand, if we take Steve Bannon at his word, which we shouldn't, um, this is a kind of fulfillment of a certain type of Leninism. So this is the first point where Higginbottom talks more about Sismondi, which I think we probably should spend a little more time on in general, because uh, he's not. People don't spend as much time on Sismondi as they probably should, because some of the same features, some of the same arguments that might make from a socialist point of view, can be applied here. That is, things that we might have assumed that Malthus suggests that there's going to be this moment where there's going to be stress between a production and that is a food supply and demands on the food supply from having too many people. You know, when it's at some moment is that those stresses going to occur? And uh, Marx is trying to figure out, well, how is it that these things occur? Are these more natural? Are they something that can apply via physics or not? And so what happens when you have too many overproduced commodities, for example? And so there's that described there as well, and that's under consumption, that there's just more stuff out there, and it's not necessarily corresponding to people's needs, but there's just stuff out there, and it screws up the price system, because capitalists can't figure out what the hell to do, and it affects, of course, all kinds of related things: revenue, wages, etc., income. And so, how is it that we can respond to that? Is there something which seems, if you're going to talk about a natural price, for example, is there a kind of a natural resolution for these problems? The idea that these are in, as they say, automatic harmony, that because eventually the system sort of works through itself. Well, he points out a fairly new article, which is actually a good thing, which we may look at some moment. It's sort of an update of yes, there's a ton of ink on capitalist crises, and it goes through a lot of iterations, a lot of interpretations, and that's kind of why we're looking at Luxembourg and this particular moment, because it is a feature of capital accumulation. You're constantly looking for stuff, you're trying to accumulate stuff, but also there is this sort of natural moment at which maybe there's a limit. There are limits to these matters, and that occurs not as a kind of nice, long, continuous stream, as we might consider with sort of the long view of history, but rather a whole bunch of other, mini crises that occur. So what happens? Is it reality changing? Are the crises bigger, better, smaller, the same? It is much more critical for people like Lenin, because he's in a place where he's being dragged out by some people that thrown into Russia in order to cause trouble in some ways. This is the whole point of sending him back, so to speak. Is to create more havoc for the Russians, and in that sense, some people from the outside see the revolution, the fight among various forms of revolutionary groups, Mensheviks, Bolsheviks, etc., as kind of a sort of thing that happens outside your border, and it's better for it to happen outside there than for polluting one's country, or that there's so many other crises that occur because of World War I that you just as soon have these things happen elsewhere. So the underlying theme is, of course, the issue of the proletariat versus the peasantry, and the question of colonized people, which is being talked about all through this period, because it's colonization versus the end of monarchies, or the restructuring of monarchies, and the restructuring of empires. It's still a period where, Britain is talking about its empire, etc. And it's not that long ago that Britain was talking about its empire, or had an empire, and yet it was, of course, disassembled in that particular sense. Now, the more limited focus, but the one which changes when Lenin dies, is and taken up by Stalin, is this idea of whether it's important to sort of throw up walls and try and get it to work out at a more sovereign level, so to speak, that is socialism in one country. And so its relation to other countries is, fraught with the fact of maybe it's necessary to be more isolated, because we have things and forces that are trying to isolate us anyway. So we should strengthen what we have within, and there's plenty to change within, even at the earliest level. So this is the kind of problem set up between the international and the national, and it is what's useful about Higginbottom here is that he tries to identify three kinds of leftist strands. That is populism, that a kind of populism that is, you sort of bypass the capitalism and move straight forward into socialism, and it's an important strand, because in some ways that's the whole business about driving industry forward. That modernization can be clearly seen as technology, and and that under Stalin, that's kind of the whole deal, is that, yeah, well, there's this big difference, but it'll end as long as we sort of drag everybody forward. And of course, economic crisis has created that, a global economic crisis. But then the next step, of course, is only another decade, and then you have another war. You have this in-between element of legal Marxists, because there's this underlying institutional structure within the revolutionary, possibility, whatever. There's a literature on the role of law in, particularly in Soviet society, or what would socialist law look like, which at one level is simply, we just have to work with what we have there. And of course, it expresses, well, on the one hand, you have to sort of see that trade is actually an important driver of economic growth. And you can't isolate yourself. And it's important to strengthen all of these sort of superstructural elements of how the revolution is supposed to go. And then the third element is the one that, you can see where the break with people like Trotsky, et cetera, occur. That is, revolutionary Marxist capitalism is already here. We're in the middle of the mode of production. We need to sort of get ready and agitate for, change. And so you're still relying on certain populist elements, right? We just have to drag the peasantry forward. And similarly, we have to have an entire structure that helps move this forward. And so all of these are at work. Lenin accepts this kind of idea. It becomes more problematic because, you see all of these things developing at the same time during what in America is the so-called Gilded Age. But at the same moment, with respect, you have actually the insertion, because the earliest, I think, insertion of capitalism into Russia occurs in the pre-Soviet period, and of course issues of natural resource extraction are actually going on simultaneous to that. It's where in the American Gilded Age, you have people like Rockefeller, et cetera, looking for new imperial kind of stuff and more resource extraction. So there's just lots of contradictions, and will a democratic revolution precede a socialist revolution, or can you sort of blow by this? And so this is a division that Sismondi sort of represents within Russian thought, and these three areas, that is populist, legal Marxists, and early Lenin. Are sort of at work, and they kind of background the issues that cause major divisions within the parties. The thing that will cause incredible frictions, and of course later on the kinds of betrayals and purges and all that other stuff. All of these things have these bases and certain points of view on these kinds of areas. That is, we should accept the fact that capitalism is here, and it can happen, and we should sort of put off a revolution until critical mass is reached, the working classes is at critical mass, et cetera, et cetera. So agitating in the streets might actually not be a good idea. That is, some people might say that. And then, of course, you need to be the other view, of course, is the early Lenin, that is capital disputes the both ideas, the populist and the legal Marxist point of view. That is, that capitalism, you can already see the contradiction. That's fairly obvious at this historical point in the post-World War I period. The working class need to prepare for its overthrow, alliance with the peasantry on shifting terms. That is, that this idea, a Bolshevik position that itself transitions. So, you're sort of building the revolution while you're trying to achieve it. And yet, it's problematic, clearly, because terrible things can happen. But, there's those little neurodniks running around. And it actually reflects itself back to the original Marxist position about what is the relationship between basing things on production, or what is the necessity, or how necessary, is building a consumer society. And you have to go back and forth on this because, you have all these people here. A lot of them are, peasantry, and you need to sort of, educate the peasantry, get them to move into cities, proletarianize them, et cetera, et cetera. All that is a big project for if you've actually taken over a country. America hasn't really had to do that in that same kind of way. So that's the kind of understanding that sort of goes on in the background. So yes, there's a Lenin critique of so-called neurodniks, because from Lenin's point of view, we've seized the whole thing. We've seized the state, even though it's under siege all the time. We essentially taken, we've killed the czars and the family, blah blah blah, and we've we're proceeding along, and we've got all these parties built up, and there's lots of agitation, and there's some social democrats running around, and blah blah, and there's the military and all that sort of stuff, and you have to sort of reconcile all those things at the same time. It's really so difficult. Now, Lenin critiques the some of these elements, the legal Marxists in particular, and partially because from a legal point of view, it is an institutional position that that where is it, chicken or egg, consumption or production, how autonomous are the departments, Department 1 and Department 2, and how interdependent are they, and all of these, what you could call contradictions. Certainly you can accuse people of contradictions. And so you can see there would be agitation that would go on, that some people would say, Well, we're doing okay. We've survived World War One. Um, we've managed to push back a lot of, white Russians have of their own accord fled, but now they're coming back in to try and retake the country, et cetera, et cetera. And that there are these positions that come up, and the positions themselves come up within the development of, as it were, Soviet Marxism or sort of early communism in that particular sense. So it is about whether the necessity of broader or more local markets is sort of part of that. And so contrasting with that, of course, are the issues that occurred between Russia, the Soviet Union, and Germany, ostensibly, because this little period where she's in jail in World War One, et cetera. There's other kinds of agitation is going on, and certainly the Soviet Union can't account for all of this, even though the identification with the Soviet Union is really important. If you remember Reds, the whole idea, the movie Reds, that you have to sort of, the biggest revolution, at the moment is occurring in Russia, and so you sort of need to get there, need to sort of figure out where, what is the correct set of beliefs that should accommodate that. And so thinking of the more international elements of a communist party, et cetera, are part of that as well. And you can see these contrasting mechanisms. It is, it's about a 50-year period of a prior period in the U.S. of labor struggles and strikes and anarchists and a whole bunch of other things that are going on. So all of these things are going on at the same time. Recalling, of course, that you have, a certain rise of quote unquote migrant anarchism in the United States, where, you've got what? There are Italians who have been forced to work in the mines, and they know how to use dynamite. And so they actually start using it on other things. And that kind of happens, then we get the 20s, the Alien Sedition Act, the creation of the FBI, all those things. Stuff's going on all at the same time. Lots of, on the one hand, mass movements. On the other hand, secrecy at the level of the state, because it was kind of necessary in order to get, conduct a war. So you can see that in thinking about Rosa Luxemburg's place in this, that she sees herself allied with some kind of social democracy or socialist thing, and then going full force in 1918 with an actual German Communist Party, which it's not that she's the founder per se, but I mean she's in right at the beginning, and then there's all these stuff going on, and you can see that there are forces against that, no different than even in the current moment. That is, you have war veterans, disgruntled war veterans who are emerging into an era of high inflation, et cetera. They form gangs, essentially the Freikorps, and that's how Luxemburg and Liebknecht get killed. So anyway, the point being is that Russia is not the only thing that's going on, even though there's this sort of insistence that it is the biggest thing around in terms of being a fully fledged, sort of communist state. Now it makes all kinds of, proclamations, problematic reorganizations that are just, horrible, that are part of being against a war, that is World War One, and sort of in favor of a kind of larger critique of global imperialism. So you have all of these things going on at the same time. And so what Higginbottom is trying to show is that, all of these things fit together, however badly, and where is proletarianism as a global thing? And that's kind of, you sort of have to work through this. And the problem, of course, is uneven development, is that not every place former colonies or agitating or anti-imperialist colonies or whatever are all at different points of development. And how is it that we work through that? Because you have on the one hand, advanced developments in India, that everything is has moved along for 50 to 70 to 90 years of colonialism. British colonialism has created a fairly effective little imperialist kind of mechanism. And so that's kind of, seeing its position relative to global proletarianization is something that actually sort of infects, you could say, left parties in India itself, is that, you have all this diverse sets of anti-imperialist parties, anti-war parties, anti-British parties, and they're not all the same thing. Some are nationalists, more nationalists, Nehru, et cetera. You have all of these things going on simultaneously, and it is complicated because they do have similar positions on, well, if we could just get all, the masses will solve all this problem. The masses move, we don't necessarily have to think about proletarianization. On the other hand, you got to feed other people. And so that's a whole another business. A bunch of people will turn into vanguardists of one kind or another. And that is often the position for some Leninists, that is seizing the state. Gives you sort of, and this is a problematic thing because it goes, it's like Blanquism, is that we're just acting in the name of the proletariat, and sort of, we're the only party, but our party is more representative than any other party, and so therefore there should be only one party because it's more efficient that way, and it's a kind of rationalization of the power of the state and its relationship to imperialism, and knowing, of course, full well from a revolutionary point of view that you sort of have to reconcile this moment of imperialism and then in your vanguard way sort of convert everything so that it is more ultimately purely classless, democratic, blah, 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 blah. It's a lot of work and doesn't, reaches some very bad conclusions. But amidst all of this, of course, is the resistance or, the reactionaries, the counter-revolutionaries, all of those other people who are trying to mess with it for all kinds of other reasons. We want to bring the czar back, blah, blah, blah. All those things have occurred at every moment, even, some that are the most absurd. But, it goes on for a pretty long time. And by the time we get to 1956, Khrushchev and anti-Stalinism or whatever, however you want to call it, there's lots of problems, and it's not solved well. The current Ukrainian crisis, the war between Ukraine and Russia, is still symptomatic of that. Those same elements are there in other countries in Central and Western Europe. There's strong leftward elements that think of this as a good international thing. On the other hand, it's still a certain imperial point of view. And now that we have oligarchs in charge, it's going to get not better, but worse. So there's, it is, it's still important to figure out what's going on in imperialism. The current debate on globalization and anti-capitalism is still that same kind of set of arguments. What is it that, what's the problem of the dominance of finance capital? How is it that we create strong institutional elements to resist that? What kind of, how is it that how is it that accumulation has brought us to this point? And how is it that you can reverse these kinds of things? And talking about the accumulation of capital still remains an important element in all of this, because it describes what does development look like. Is it more even, or is it more uneven? And it's because a lot of people would actually base their revolutionary principles on whatever is it historically important to do that or not? And so you can see when you get back to the beginning point is this idea of the departmental schema. How important is it for production to be revolutionized in that particular way. What is that moment of realization when you build, things like markets, et cetera? And you can see how that can be problematic under Stalin, just as an example. Lenin dies, Stalin, all these things are growing and are great, but you still have masses in the countryside. You have some people who demand a sort of total restructuring of land, um, and you've got people to scapegoat like the kulaks, et cetera. All that kind of stuff is there in terms of history. Needless to say, there are always conflicts in structure, and so there's that. Higginbottom talks about, well, capitalist society is doing all this stuff, and it's being productive or whatever. What is the role of other things, other classes that are part of this? This is part of this sort of thinking about what reproduction is going on. You can accept and have to accept sort of that it's just uneven. There's imperialism is in different measures out there, and there are different class alliances. And you need to get this sense of, well, how do you reconcile the relationship to other non-capitalist societies? And so that's kind of a big deal. And that's where money comes back in terms of trying to explain capital accumulation. Marx has sort of tied his analysis, because we're in volume 2, still to gold. He's going to get past that, but that's kind of hemming in his argument, because he hasn't fully developed this financial capital thing that we're now currently figuring out. And then you haven't even figured out, questions of force, how necessary, and particularly in the post-World War I period, how important is militarization? Should one be an anti-militarist? How much militarization is important? You have red Russians versus white Russians. We just need more guns. That's kind of a thing. And, but yet we can sort of build all these things, since we're beginning to create the means by which these things can be produced. It is, it's fairly simple, but it is actually fairly important. The idea that the military-industrial complex in the Soviet Union is still the key for all of this. It's not just tractor production, but it's the same assembly lines that ultimately will be converted not to tractor production, but to tank production. And that's kind of where it's going to go. And anyway, there's Luxembourg and Bukharin. I think I've yammered on far too much. You can listen to the tape yourself. I think what's important is that he places this in context with Joan Robinson, who probably should have gotten a Nobel Prize, David Harvey, who, Higginbottom sort of, asserts that that what Harvey is doing is, he doesn't quite deal with certain ideas. Money is not dealt with enough by Harvey in Higginbottom's mind. And that we're past imperialism, that whatever things we're doing about globalization and anti-capitalism are not about opposing something that is imperialist, but rather, we're past that, and we're at some new phase that we have to sort of deal with in that has a certain component to it that has institutional elements that you need to sort of keep working through. And that's sort of natural. I mean, if you've, determine that you're looking at constant interrelation between all the different pieces, that certain elements you can rationalize and perhaps become an apologist for certain types of socialistic forms without getting to that moment that Higginbottom is sort of thinking about. Well, where is we're back to the original moment then. How does accumulation occur, and is it natural or unnatural to need crises? And so that's kind of where we reach at the end of Higginbottom's commentary, is about what counts as revolutionary democracy, and the reemergence, as it were, of interests in Luxembourg it's wider than you think. One can assert. and there is this fracture between in the Western Marxist context between that and a much more rigorous kind of point of view about that you sort of need to think about what kind of crisis is going to occur, and maybe and this is no different than religion in that sense. It's the second coming, you know upon us? Is it not upon us? Do we have to go run around and create the conditions for which the second coming is going to occur? So therefore, if we move in our little accelerationist way to, mess stuff up, create chaos, maybe even compel, the worst aspects of society to sort of create chaos, then maybe we can get this to happen faster. It's very, unfortunately, simplified, simplistic even sort of way of approaching that. But that it's a question of history of how much do we revise or retcon the history. How important is a revolution in one place and not in another place. This is an argument that underlies certain issues about the 49 revolution in China, is to reflect on the issues that go all the way back to the 20s. At what moment, was it, how do we acknowledge the initial Republican move, the formation of a non-dynastic government, that it was clearly important? It didn't go far enough, perhaps, in the initial period, for all kinds of the usual reasons. The war intervened, the invasion of the Japanese, et cetera, et cetera. And so, that it unfortunately had to wait, and which is why it's signified in an important way in the 75th year, and that is the 49 revolution, is that all of the things sort of are happening and sort of needed to happen, and mistakes were made. We followed a Russian line for, a bunch of years, almost a full decade, and that, some of that needed to be dealt with, and that's the current crisis. Is if there is a crisis, that is that you have to have markets are necessary, of a certain type, but you still need to have a kind of vanguard party, and that's the communists and China. Is that it still is a Leninist vanguard party from that particular perspective. That's a single party state, and and adjustments were made, and by force of scale, you have a market power, resource power, but then you're also seeing the constraint, which is an important issue, and that is the ecological constraint that, oh, well, we still need to dig coal, but do we really have to? And yes, we're putting in remediation for it. On the other hand, we're still increasing coal plants, and so it's not good in the bigger picture. So big mess. I included a couple of videos here that include actually there's this kind of interesting side glance into Lasordo's writings. Remember that we're looking at Henry's translation of the piece on Stalin, but Lasordo's written other stuff, and so it is this reemergence of looking at Lasordo's stuff, despite the fact that it's still got that Stalinist thing lurking in the background, but he still writes interesting stuff, and it's important commentaries on the role of the Communist Party in post-war post-war socialism in Italy. So that's all there. I know you can't see it on this screen, but it's there. There's several different things in here that are at the bottom here that we might consider. Let me also open up, I think it's open right now, where we're going to head. And that is sometime this week, whether it's tomorrow or the day after that, we're going to go back to, I managed to convert the first chapter of the Paul's translation, Paul Writer, Paul North translation of volume 1 of Capital, and it does read more smoothly. With all due respect, it reads better. It's smoother for me anyway. It's easier to to see the explanations. And of course, so this is a complete chapter one with footnotes. So you may want to spend time, and I apologize for the way I copied it in there. I copied it in as a system of images. And so it doesn't have that same editing capability. And yes, I know we can do it better than that, but I haven't done that. So, but it is a complete copy of the Paul's first chapter, The Commodity, in Capital, Volume 1. And I hope that some people will take a look at it. We may read from it as we move through. Not that we're going to do a whole comparative analysis necessarily, but it reads smoother. I really, it is smoother. More interesting, as always, is the truth of text is often in the footnotes, and so it functions here as an end note for the first chapter. There's some really good ones in here, and the notes are actually quite useful, considering that stuff's happened since the last English translation. So certain other things are in here which are useful to note. And we'll get onto that, I hope. I hope people will find that interesting. And yes, I'm not doing this just simply to be annoying. I recall, of course, that there are actually several books that only discuss chapter 1 of volume 1 of Capital, because that's like, that's like the big deal. So, imagine, if you will, people have had a lot of trouble with this, just the first chapter of volume 1. So a lot of ink has been spilled. So we should appreciate that. I may drag in 2 of those particular texts because they're actually pretty good texts. And I don't think that the Pauls do much of an analysis of those 2 other texts. They refer to them, but that's pretty much it. Okay. So abruptly speaking, I think I've gotten to the end of my little rope here. I've tried to give you an overview of, and yes, I went over my time slightly, to try and give you an overview of Higginbotham's Lecture 9, which gives you a kind of broader comparative sense of how people address the fundamental questions in this section about reproduction, about how things accumulate and grow, and what are the kind of details of that, because it is the details of that that often are the problem at various moments in history. Do you have enough markets? Should you have markets at all? What is the historical situation? Because that sort of affects whether you make a decision about more markets or less markets or no markets. Similarly, the issue of the disposition of classes, and ultimately it does raise a question that's not for here, but that is suggested elsewhere, and that is the issue for Lenin, or the idea of a vanguard party. And I've made comments elsewhere that, Trumpism functions as a vanguard party. It's really scary. But with all due respect to Steve Bannon's knowledge of Lenin, it's kind of where he's going, and kind of what Trumpism represents. And you can see it solidify in terms of the underlying operations of key oligarchs who are sort of on board with this idea that, it doesn't matter. We have all the money. We're just going to make decisions, and we're going to start, becoming super annoying in that case. That's the Elon Musk sort of deal, is that he thinks he can engage with certain other elements. And somehow I'm not sure that Elon's security services can, there's other stuff's going on. And there'll be this moment. We'll see. It'll be interesting. Lest you think that's unimportant, we're still averaging about 1 Russian a month jumping out a window or falling out of a window, however you want to talk about it. But these things are still happening, and they're civilians and not members of the military. So it's stuff's going on. And just for example, they just merged the 3. I don't know if they're the 3 largest, but there are 3 three of the oil companies in Russia have merged this past. There's an announcement that they're putting them together. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that, I'm sure, that have to do with power and other kinds of, oligarchic sort of amusements. But you can see something else is going on, and it has to do with, of course, the big shadow oil supply, blah, blah, blah. All those things are happening as we speak, and they're going to affect us in the coming years. So, okay. But are there comments, brickbats? Joe, if you're still there, you can, I guess, cut it off. Thank you very much for your attention. I know I've been sort of stumbling along here. If you sort of listen to Higginbottom carefully, don't get too bogged down, and he does kind of veer off occasionally, but it's still worth kind of working through, and I hope people will do that. So thank you for cutting this off, Joe. Seeing no interventions, I'll thank you for your attention, and we will probably do a little more of this, whether it's Capital Volume 1, the translation, or a little bit more on this Higginbottom stuff, because there's really a lot of stuff here. A whole sidelight on Sismondi is actually kind of useful, but we'll see. Joe?